The Joe Rogan Experience.
What's the most compelling modern thing that you've seen?
Oh my God, I can't talk about it. Unfortunately, this is my frustration, Joe, because I know what I've seen. I know what my colleagues have seen, right? And to this day, there's video that's coming in on a regular and routine basis that is very, very compelling. And if
how do they hide this stuff from the general public?
Well, we have classified systems. We hide a lot of
things. Right, but how is it getting filmed? Is any of it getting filmed by the general public, or is all this military stuff?
So let me backtrack a little bit. There's a general public that is filming stuff, but from a Department of Defense perspective, our focus now. Aero is a different story, but when I was in the government, we had to be very, very careful of something we called intelligence oversight. Back in the 60s and 70s, the U.S. intelligence apparatus, particularly in the Department of Defense, was kind of naughty. They were doing things they shouldn't do. They were spying on students and they were spying on American citizens. And they were doing things. Yeah,
crazy.
Right? Say it isn't so. So Congress passed some laws and said, okay, you can no longer do this kind of stuff on American citizens, right? You can't conduct intelligence operations on American citizens. You can't do it. It's illegal, right? Okay. So you have Executive Order 12333 and all these other rules and laws and DOD 5240.1 that all come out and say no mas. So Department of Defense is supposed to focus on military. That's it. You don't bring in U.S. persons' information and ingest them into a Department of Defense database, especially a Department of Defense intelligence database. That's a super no-no. That's called U.S. persons' information, and it's pretty much verboten. So our focus was looking specifically at military-sourced information. I was not focusing at all on what the private citizens were seeing because at the end of the day, we couldn't use it. You can't do anything with the data.
And it seems like you got plenty of compelling footage from the military.
Overwhelming. There's absolutely no doubt that we didn't have to look at civilian data because we had better collection sensor systems from the military that was looking at stuff and giving us better insight.
If you can't tell us about, can you give us some sort of an understanding of like what you're talking about?
Yeah, sure.
Without being specific?
Yeah, let me see. Okay, yeah. There is a video, high-resolution video, of I can't say what platform it was taken from. I can't say where it was taken from.
Okay.
But an object that, do you know how large an offshore oil derrick is? They're huge, right?
Yeah.
They're almost like a small city, right? They're like one city block. They're huge. They're enormous things. There is a video that shows one of these objects underwater that goes by. The speed was calculated between 450 and 550 knots underwater, and it was bigger than the offshore derrick that it was passing because you could see in the video the offshore derrick, and you could see this thing zip right by it.
Jesus.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of them, right? A lot of them are reported as being transmedium.
Right. So that exactly. Why do we use the term UAP, right? Now it's unidentified anomalous phenomenon because it's all domain. Initially it was UFO, unidentified flying object. And for several reasons they changed the name. One of them, not just because of stigma like people think, but because the word flying object means flight. And
right.
You have to have wings to fly. That's flight. And these things don't have wings. So that term, we're not even sure is even accurate anymore because they're not necessarily flying. We see them underwater. We see them super high altitude. So the term was changed to unidentified aerial phenomenon. But again, that did not encompass all the observations we were seeing. So now the term UAP, I think the latest description of it is unidentified anomalous phenomenon to help describe this multi-domain or transmedium characteristic that we are beginning to see and record that these things can do. And that is, I'm going to, if I can digress for a second, because that's super important, Joe. Mm-hmm. We have transmedium vehicles, right? We have things like seaplanes, and it's a plane and it can float on water. But let's face it, a seaplane is neither a really good plane or a really good boat because it's a compromise. It's a design compromise between an object that you want to perform in the air and in the sea. And that's why it's neither really good at both. Same thing with, for example, the space shuttle. It goes out into space and it can glide down, but it's not a very good airplane, comes down like a brick,
right.
Because there's design compromises and performance compromises. But what we are seeing doesn't have any of that attributable compromise. It's not, these objects aren't slowing down. They're not changing their performance capabilities. They can do the same thing that we're seeing in the air and possibly in space and even underwater. So that is a fundamentally different type of technology than we are used to dealing with.
Is the assumption that they are doing something with space-time and gravity around them rather than using something like a jet propulsion engine that blasts fire out the back and it makes it go fast forward?
Right.
That they're doing something that alters the gravity around them.
Yeah. So
and that's why they can go through everything.
Yeah. So we had some of the best scientists on the team, folks like Dr. Hal Puthoff and some other folks that I'm not allowed to say their names, Dr. Eric Davis and some others, that were doing the calculations, mathematical calculations on how this is possible. And the consensus was by the scientists, not me, because I'm not a physics expert, I'm not a astrophysicist. They were saying that, so let me back up here. Initially, the government for years was trying to identify the different exotic technologies that could explain the different performance characteristics. And it was during the ATIP years that the scientists had this consensus that if you had one type of technology, if you could do one thing, all these other observables now become possible. Kind of think of like a unifying theory. And so if you had the ability to create this bubble around you in a localized area that insulated you from the effects of Earth's gravity. Now, what is gravity? People think that, when I drop my glasses, that's gravity. That's not gravity. That's an effect of gravity. Gravity is the warping of space-time. And that's important because people you hear the term thrown around a lot, but they don't realize that space and time are actually connected. They are one and the same. They're opposite sides, if you will, of the same coin. And so you can't have one without the other. And so you have this ability to create a bubble around you that insulates you from the warping of space-time, let's say in this case Earth's gravity or something like that. Then the way you experience time inside that bubble is perhaps fundamentally different than the way you might experience space-time outside that bubble because you're not subject to the effects of gravity, which would explain potentially why things don't need wings and why they don't need propulsion systems like that, right? So it's a completely different way of looking at how we understand physics and how we, as humans, move about. Everything we do is fundamentally force equals mass times acceleration, right? F equals ma, right? Mass times acceleration, and you get force. This may be something a little bit different. This is not using, again, conventional thrust, or if I Newtonian, right? If I push this way, I have an equal and opposite reaction that way, right?
Are there any theories as to how it's accomplishing this?
There is. Actually, Dr. Hal Puthoff about 3 years ago gave a speech on this, a very interesting lecture about this technology. And if you ever have the chance, you really should have him on because he's an incredible human being. He's also the one who helped start the government's remote viewing program and a bunch of other stuff for the government. He's been involved in a lot of our nation's probably most classified efforts. But he was working with us on ATIP as one of our scientists. And he gave a lecture about 3 years ago to some other scientists about the specifics on how this is possible. I am not a scientist, so I'm definitely not going to speak on behalf of Hal Puthoff because I'm sure I will muck it up. But I do recall a time when he came into our skiff and gave us about a 3-hour lecture on this unifying theory. And at that moment, it was very much for us the epiphany that a lot of us had been searching for. He's like, look, at the end of the day, this is how it's possible. And that was kind of this, wow. So it's really not.
Can you give us a moron's
magic
view of how it's possible?
Yeah.
Explain it to someone like me.
Yeah, well, I'm in that category, Joe. So,
Good. We're speaking the same language.
Yes, sir. Yeah, single syllable grunts, right? So you have an object like this cup on your table, and you want it to be insulated from the effects of Earth's gravity. So you create this bubble artificially using a certain energetic source at a certain frequency, and it interacts with certain material, certain metamaterial, and I got to be careful exactly what I say, but certain skin of the craft, this aluminum via the cup here, and all of a sudden, whoop, you have this bubble around you where what you see on the outside is not necessarily what you see on the inside. In fact, may I do a little more drawing for you? Okay, and forgive me, I'm not an artist, so I'm going to do this upside down for you, and then I'm going to kind of scoot this just a little here. All right, let's do this. So, unfortunately, I know your audience can't see this, but actually it's probably
okay.
good.
Some people can. There's a video form of it. Well, I'm sure this will get on. It'll be on YouTube as well.
It's probably good that they don't, because I'm not an artist. But
okay.
Let's say this is a two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional space.
Okay.
And in essence,
so what you've done is essentially you created a three-dimensional looking grid stacked. It looked like stacked boxes on top of each other.
Yeah, right. And so you have this. You have location A and location B. Mm-hmm. And let's say I go from Los Angeles to Baltimore.
Okay.
And it takes me 5 hours to fly at 500 miles an hour. That's a function of distance over time. And in essence, you can mark that linearly like this. So I fly, it takes me 5 hours, there I am.
Okay.
If you had the ability to compress space-time, and not a lot, just a little bit, and you were able to allow these points to be a little closer together, now in essence, what took you, let's say, 5 hours and 500 miles an hour to do it, you can do it in 1 hour, and you can do it in much less time. But to the observer outside, because we're still in the same universe, we would see something like that. We would see this incredible hopscotching ability to, if you will, take a shortcut through space-time. And so what would appear to be instantaneous acceleration, hypersonic velocity, and other things, now becomes a reality. And so that is fundamentally what the scientists had discovered. And so it seems like science fiction, but when you understand the mathematics and some of the theorem that they've proposed, a lot of these other observables become possible.
So these are essentially just theoretical explanations of how these things are moving.
Yeah, and I'm not a scientist. I want to be very careful. I don't want to misrepresent anything. There's a whole lot of other stuff that if you can do that, all of a sudden now makes sense and may describe the observations that people are seeing and why they're kind of hard to see and they seem obscure.
Right.
And so I think from a governmental perspective, that it was kind of a revelatory moment for the folks in our program.
So they realized one of the reasons why these things are weird looking is because they're creating. You want a light?
Do you mind? I'm sorry.
Yeah, take this.
Thank you.
So the back thing, the other side. Push that down. There you go. Bam.
Thank you very much.
No problem. So how much of this is theoretical and how much of this is observed from recovered vehicles?
I am not allowed to talk about what the government may or may not have in its possession, other than that so I went through a very lengthy Pentagon review process. Recently, I wrote, I won't talk about it here, but I wrote something, and I had to go through Pentagon to have a review process, and it took almost a year. In this thing I wrote, I talk about up to the part I can talk about, and they approved for me to talk about up to that point. When it comes to what the government may or may not have in its possession, all I can simply say is that there is very compelling evidence to suggest that the U.S. government is in absolute possession of exotic material that is not made by humans. Now, beyond that, I can't really expound upon. I haven't been given permission to talk about it. But what I can say is what I've already said for the record, which has been approved by the Pentagon. I won't get in trouble by saying it. Is that we are there's very compelling data to suggest that we are in possession of.
Why is the Pentagon teasing us? Why do they tell you? Why are they allowing you to say we are in possession of something that was not made by human beings, but not allowed to elaborate, not allowed to show these very compelling videos that you're talking about that you've seen?
I don't. Well, two reasons. I don't think they have a choice. I think with now the introduction of cell phones and Ring cameras, the cat's out of the bag. It's the worst kept secret at this point. Two, there is a faction, unlike before in the Cold War, I believe there is a faction of people inside the government that do want this conversation to occur. But equally, there's still a faction of people that are very mad with me